Well, welcome to another installment of Recalibrate for Life Baptist Church. This one is brought to you from the kitchen of Allan and Judy Wiebe. So last Sunday, Pastor Larry talked about being humble toward one another. And the idea of demonstrating humility and submission to our brothers and sisters in Christ is very much in keeping with something that Christ said towards the end of his ministry. In fact, it was at the Last Supper and just after Judas left the meal to betray Christ. In what seems to be a final summary of all Christ's teachings, sort of a, if you don't remember anything else, remember this statement. Christ says in John 13:34, "A new commandment I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." The disciples may have cringed a little bit when they heard Christ suggesting a new commandment. There are already about 613 commandments for Moses that they had to obey, including a smaller subgroup of critical commandments called the Decalogue, or the 10 Commandments. They probably did not want to hear about any more commandments. And here's something we all know about commandments: rules and laws. The more of them there are, the more loopholes we'll create to get around them. The Pharisees were masters of manipulation, using creative interpretations and superimposing one law over another to achieve their desired effect. For example, the law that says to honor your father and mother, including providing for them if they are in need, would be nullified by the Pharisees by them taking the resources they owned and could be used to help their parents and dedicating these resources to God. This was called Corban from Numbers 30, where it was said that if you pledge something to God, you must not break the pledge. So then they could say that they couldn't help their parents because their money was tied up and dedicated to God, a loophole. The housing complex where my parents just moved from was a difficult place to find a parking spot for visitors. However, there was one prime spot that had a sign in front of it that said, "Absolutely no parking between 7 and 9 a.m., Tuesday and Friday." Under this was another sign that said, "Service vehicles only." To my mother's somewhat displeasure, I would always park there because my rationale was only service vehicles are allowed to park there on Tuesdays and Fridays between 7 to 9 a.m. Otherwise, anyone can park there any other time. I even took a picture of the sign to help me in my case if I ever got a ticket. We all look for loopholes. Have you ever seen a collective bargaining agreement between an employer and a union? It is often a massive document that details absolutely every minute detail of responsibility between employees and the companies they work for. If a loophole is found, they will modify the agreement to plug the hole, usually by adding some other rules. In fact, the rules are often so formally restrictive that the business couldn't even function properly if every rule was followed. That is why during contract negotiations, sometimes the union will adopt a work-to-rule action, which means that instead of performing work duties with some degree of reasonability and flexibility, the employees will simply work in accordance with only the complex details of the agreement. This can be crippling for the employer, but sometimes a very effective negotiation tactic for the union. The new commandment to love one another as Christ has loved us is simple and transforming, and actually raises the bar far higher than any laws or rules. This commandment is the bridge to our differences and disagreements. And by loving each other as Christ loved us, demonstrates to the world the gospel and the true heart of God, and evidence that we are Christ's followers. It shows what's best for you attitude instead of what's best for me attitude. If we loved the way Christ loved us, we wouldn't even need to know the commandment to not steal. We would just realize that if Christ loved us so much that he gave his life for us, we will certainly not take from someone else what is theirs. We would rather give to them something that is ours. That's what Christ did for us. If we loved the way Christ loved us, we wouldn't even need to know the commandment to not commit adultery. We would just realize that if Christ loved us so much that he gave his life for us, we will certainly keep ourselves pure and honor our spouses with going even further in our thoughts and actions to gain their trust and increase our level of intimacy with them. That's what Christ did for his bride. If we loved the way Christ loved us, we wouldn't even need to know the commandment to not covet. We would just realize that if Christ loved us so much that he gave his life for us, we will certainly not always be craving what others have and just using others as a means for comparison instead of fostering a healthy relationship based on our own contentment with the place God has put us. This is what Christ did for us when he gave us even what was rightfully his to restore our relationship to his Father. Maybe I shouldn't have parked in that spot because even though I am given a specific time window rule that I could follow, what if there was some emergency at a time outside of this rule and the service vehicle needed to park there? What's best for the housing management in this case? What if the employees only had one rule? What's best for my employer? There would virtually be no need for any other rules. What if the employer only had one rule? What is best for my employees? There would virtually be no need for any other rules. Do you see that Christ's love not only automatically meets the requirements of the law and gets rid of all loopholes, but expects far more sacrifice than any law would require? And it is simple. In any situation, only one question needs to be asked. What would Christ's love require of me? As you move through your day and your week, in all your activities and contact with others, ask yourself this one question. What would Christ's love require of me?